Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore and studies contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, President Xi Jinping's social and geopolitical calendar seems pretty full. He returned last Friday from a European visit, his first in 5 years. The last time he was there was in 2019. The selection of destinations, France, Serbia, and Hungary, was considered. 2024 marks 60 years of Sino-France diplomatic relations. There have been a series of events in both countries to also celebrate cultural relations. Serbia has been a traditional ally of China, and both states marked the 25th anniversary of NATO's bombing of Belgrade. Now, 5 bombs also hit the Chinese embassy, killing 3 Chinese journalists. China was enraged. NATO claimed it was an accident, and then US President Bill Clinton also apologized. But the wound has not healed. In fact, a Danish journalist, Jens Hulsel, published an investigative report alleging that the bombing was deliberate because Western officials had found out that the embassy was being used to transmit communications on behalf of Milosevic's army. Madeleine Albright, who was then the US Secretary of State, called the report balderdash, but the Observer, which had partnered with Hulsel's publication Politiken, doubled down in a follow-up piece. Something was amiss because it was known that the target was selected by the CIA, which is rather unusual for a NATO bombing campaign. So while she was in Serbia, Politika, a Serbian newspaper, published his op-ed. And she focused primarily, and for the most part, on Sino-Serbian relations and trade and other cooperation. He did make a pointed reference to the bombing, saying China would not forget it and would never allow such tragedy to repeat itself. With Hungary, which was the third destination, it is the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. During his visit, Xi said China was upgrading diplomatic ties with Hungary to an all-weather partnership. We are willing to take this as a new starting point, push bilateral relations and pragmatic cooperation into a golden channel, and move towards a higher level. For his part, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has expanded his country's relations with China since he came into power in 2010. Hungary is also scheduled to assume the rotating presidency of the European Union in July, and she has encouraged China's closest European Union ally to play a bigger role in the EU and push for new and greater development of China-EU relations. Now, as we do this episode, as I said, Xi's calendar is pretty full. President Vladimir Putin is in Beijing. And to discuss Xi's Europe visit and President Putin's Beijing visit, I'm joined by Einar Tangen, who's a senior fellow at Taihe Institute, which is an independent non-profit think tank based in Beijing. Mr. Tangen is also a frequent commentator on international news outlets on China's foreign security and trade relations. Einar, thank you for being on this episode. Let me begin with, Xi's Europe visit, which seems to have been, as far as the Europeans are concerned, and I'm just giving you a sense of the headlines, Xi's charm and divide Europe visit. So give me a sense of how far do you think that describes the visit?
It was all very, very positive. Compare that to the rather dire economic straits that Europe is in. And then the political uncertainty above and beyond that as to whether Donald Trump will be president and whether he'll follow through and all the things that he said he's going to do to Europe. Obviously, he still bears a grudge. He's mentioned it before when Europeans were openly celebrating in the streets when he lost the last election. This seemed to have hit a very deep nerve with somebody who has been known to be vindictive. But he also doesn't believe that America should be extending any kind of security guarantees for free. He did that during his last term. He was held back by adults in the room. But if he is elected this time, there will be no adults. They will just be followers. And it was more likely that the Grand Alliance, NATO, many interests in the Far East will be ignored.
Right. So let me break down this visit in terms of, for a moment, keeping aside Serbia and Hungary, because those two states have been traditionally very close to China over a very long period of time. Let's talk about France. Now, Macron last month spoke at Sorbonne as a kind of sequel to a speech that he had made there after, after being elected for his first term. And he talked about precisely one of the points that you raised with reference to Trump, with reference to US domestic politics, but also with reference to what's happening within and around Europe, and spoke about a new European unity. He spoke about European independence and greater strength. Now, these are some things that, in a paradoxical sort of way, can both bring China and France or EU closer, and at the same time kind of pull them apart, in the sense that, obviously there's going to be greater competition. I believe Macron also does not believe in the kind of restrictions that even Joe Biden has been placing on Chinese manufactured goods, especially semiconductors. So give me a sense of, we know that he took Xi to his grandmother's place in the Pyrenees, and they had a great time, and he does believe in extending that kind of personal touch. But give me a sense of the substantive part of the discussion, because like last time in 2019, when he brought in Jean-Claude Juncker and made it into a trilateral, this time too, he did the same thing. He, in fact, also wanted Scholz to be there, but Scholz could not. And we're going to come to that, because I really am interested in knowing why Olaf Scholz was not there. But give me a sense of the substance on this.
Well, he does. I mean, there's less substance than posturing. What you had was Macron trying to channel de Gaulle. He was trying to stand up. I mean, and a lot of that has to do with domestic politics. He's currently trailing behind his right-wing opponent, Le Pen. And, things aren't going well for France. I mean, next year, this year, they're expecting all of 0.7% growth in France, as opposed to Germany, 0.2%, UK 0.5%, US follows at 2.7%. And then you have Russia. Remember, Russia was supposed to be decimated. They were going to crush its economy. Putin would be out on the street with an angry mob following after him. Instead, Russia is going to grow by 3.2%, eclipsing all of Europe. China, of course, is at 4.9%. Now, these are not projections of unfriendly sources. This is the IMF. They're the ones who are saying that this is the situation as it stands. And, ironically, they're pointing out that China's resilience is the result of fiscal discipline built up over many years. And this was a statement by Director Kristina Georgieva. I mean, rare praise, and it's a contrast to, let us say, the fiscal imprudence of both Europe and the United States. So when you start talking about Macron, he's in a bit of a pickle. So is Europe. They are far from united. They're still trying to figure things out. They have very, very different relationships with China. France, it's important, but it's not the most important. For Germany, it is the most important. And that's kind of why you weren't seeing the German contingent show up. But you had the usual doom and gloom coming from the EU side. She was intent. Von der Leyen was intent on throwing a few threats in there about how they're going to go after Chinese EVs and things like this, and saying that somehow China was not was ruining the world with its overcapacity. Gee whiz, I remember 30, 40 years ago when Europe and America were dominating manufacturing. I don't recall them saying that they were doing anything untoward. And ironically, you remember Japan? Japan during the late 70s and early 80s, exactly the same words were said. Japan was using its subsidized overcapacity to ruin the world and take American jobs. You had congressmen and senators out bashing Japanese cars and boom boxes. She was long on, as you said, the charm and talking about people-to-people exchanges and things like that. But he didn't leave a lot behind. He said he would listen. He did. Obviously, we'll see what happens in this latest visit with Putin.
Yeah. I was, when I was prepping for this program, I kind of pulled out something that Shangjin Wei, who's an academic also, was the chief economist for the Asian Development Bank also. And he wrote this piece for Columbia Business School, and he is taught there also. And he essentially is saying that, the Made in China 2025 policy, or call it the industrial policy, is not something which is, directed against any particular country. It's more like something which gives a certain kind of direction or an incentive, if you will. And it kind of, resonated with something that I read, KU Jen's. I picked this up like 3 months ago, and I was going through this book, and she has tried to explain, as I'm sure you know, that there is a particular model, and there have been different facets of that model. Some of those things since 1979 have actually worked, some have not worked, and so the model itself has evolved. But she wrote something very interesting, and let me read this out. And she's talking about innovation because a lot of the what shall I say? For want of a better word, a lot of the headlines, the propaganda that's coming out is about innovation. Overcapacity is, of course, one other thing. And she's talking about, and she says this core feature of the market economy is an important one to keep in mind in the context of US-China technology competition. Competition can be constructive as it forces companies to innovate when there is a close competitor in sight. This was the case with the US when Japan dominated semiconductors, just the point that you were making a short while ago. Or when France and Germany quickly converged on the US in terms of productivity and innovativeness. In the 1960s, the response back then was not a series of protectionist pressures or threats to decouple or de-risk, which is now another term that being used in Europe, but geared up innovation policy like the Research and Development Tax Credit Scheme of 1981, adopted by the Reagan administration. So now, of course, it's being evaluated through a rather narrow prism of national security. Do you think that this is now kind of a move away from the hyper globalization, forget about hyper globalization, even globalization and the WTO rules, and it's now becoming protectionist even under Joe Biden? Forget Trump. I mean, he started it, but even Biden is so reshoring and creating blocks and sanctioning certain states seems now to be center stage in terms of geoeconomics.
Absolutely, Ejaz. I mean, here's the irony. If you start taking a look at globalization, the WTO 2001, China enters, doesn't get a very good deal, kind of stores that one away in the back of their head. But they worked hard. Really hard. They didn't have anything. They didn't have large stocks of resources or cash on hand, anything like that. They were able to rise to the second largest. But let's take a look at the profits. Yes, the corporate world in Europe and America decided they could make more money if they outsourced to other countries, and they created this kind of global supply chain. But keep in mind, 2/3 of all of the profits went to Europe, America, South Korea, and Japan. Basically, the rich got richer. They traded, to a certain end, the jobs in their areas for these profits. But let's take a look at it from other. Let's say the U.S. had not gone into China and said, "Look, we're not going to be part of that," and Europe had. Guess who would have won that competition? Europe would have been able to lower prices. It would have been able to outcompete American products. So in essence, once one company goes over, it turns into a torrent because they can't afford not to. They have to reduce their costs in order to stay competitive. So you had different currents that were running there. One, economic necessity to stay in the game. Two, this desire for profits, which did not trickle down to the average worker, but were kept in the boardrooms. They rewarded themselves handsomely for all of their handiwork. And then all of a sudden it became China's fault. How is that possible? I mean, let's put it another way. Let's say, China wasn't even here. It would simply mean that Europe and America would be buying from somewhere else, wherever that may be. The fact is, these developed countries cannot even take care of their basic needs: clothing, furniture, shoes. They can be made cheaper elsewhere, right? So all of this stuff is just complete nonsense. It's hypocritical, blaming somebody else for the fact that instead of investing, as you pointed out, investing in a more competitive economy, what you saw is people in the boardrooms just shoving money wholesale into their pockets and congratulating themselves, and without a thought to the common man who, for the last 45 years in America, has gotten the short end of the stick. 45 years ago, 62% of Americans were middle class. Today, it's 50% and going down. You wonder why there's anger in the U.S.? It's very clearly they feel betrayed. People who were supposed to look out for them didn't.
But I want you to take a step back. And it seems to me that when it started, and as you rightly said, that the initial deal that China got at the WTO, although the United States was helpful and all of that, it wasn't particularly a lucrative one. Some of the studies show that for $100 price product, China was getting about $1.25 out of that. Now, it seems to me that while China was part of the low end of the supply chain of products, it was fine. But as China began to go higher up the global value chain, especially into technological innovation, and for that technological innovation, not just simply to translate into more economic growth for China and better infrastructure, but also military technological advancement. Would you agree with me that rest of it is a red herring, and that is really the crux of the issue?
Yeah, absolutely, Ejaz. And I'm not, we can talk about it, but let's use an example. Japan. Japan was doing exactly the same things. And if you go back and look at the newspapers and the television shows in the 70s and early 80s, you'll see exactly the same thing. Japan is getting ahead of us, despite the fact that it was a democracy. There was all these things about it's an autocracy because one party's been in power for too long. And, there's intimation that they were racist and things like this. And there are a lot of jokes about Japanese tourists and how they were, running all over the place, buying everything up, and their, silly little cameras and bus tours and all this, like, very, very demeaning. The usual empire attitude, colonialism at its best. So what did they do? They forced Japan to sign the Plaza Accord in 1986. And today, Japan's economy is worth less in real dollar terms than it was in 1986. So that's exactly what the US would like to do. The playbook is we don't let anyone get ahead of us. And if we're too lazy to compete, we'll use the Tonya Harding defense. Tonya Harding was a Olympic figure skater. Her biggest rival and close friend, Christine, I'm sorry, I can't remember her last name. She decided that that she could lose the Olympics to her, so she had her boyfriend and another friend go out and try to break her legs. And this seems to be par for the course right now in Washington. They don't believe that anybody should get near the U.S., and if it does, it's somehow an existential threat to the universe. How many wars has China started, in these last years versus the U.S.? I mean, it's just ridiculous. There's this constant need to accuse others of doing exactly what the U.S. is doing, and the hypocrisy is catching up to it. You can see that in Gaza. Where's a call for human rights when 35,000 people, women and children, have been butchered by a country that's, says it's entitled to do so, and the U.S. is supplying the weapon systems, bombs, and bullets that are killing these people.
So, Einar, while you were speaking, since I had mentioned Shang Jin Wei's piece, I just pulled it up. And there's a very interesting graph here. He says, to be sure, Made in China 2025 is essentially an industrial policy, but industrial policies are not necessarily unfair or incompatible with WTO rules. In fact, the very concept of state-guided development was practically invented by the United States over 200 years ago, when Alexander Hamilton, the country's first Treasury Secretary, called for more government support of manufacturing through tariffs and other policies. Since then, US governments have channeled massive subsidies through the Treasury, Defense, and Energy departments, as well as the National Science Foundation and other institutions to fund innovation. The German government's Industry 4.0 strategy is a direct inspiration for the Chinese plan. So it seems that China is not doing anything which is out of the ordinary. It is doing things, and sometimes those things might come across to other states as unfair, but it's doing things to promote its own interests, and at the same time buying businesses and establishing factories elsewhere in Europe and in the United States, and by doing that also offering local employment, which kind of neutralizes the argument about the Chinese having stolen the jobs away from the Americans.
Ejaz, I was chairman of my state's International Trade Council in Wisconsin. I reported to the legislature and the governor. And I used to laugh when I heard that China stole jobs. How does that work exactly? Do they come over in the middle of the night and dismantle the factory and take it with them? Even Regina Raimondo, the current Secretary of Commerce, likes to tell the story about her father who worked for Bulova Watch. Now, Bulova Watch came under increased pressure because of Timex, an American company that was pouring out, all sorts of watches and things like that at very attractive prices. Bulova was somewhere in the middle. They were not as famous as Rolex, etc. Unfortunately, they had to move, and they moved to China. And she, for some reason, holds a grudge against China, as if the government there said, you have to, put a gun to the bull of a management's head and said, if you don't come here, I'm going to blow your brains out. No, it was the management there who went to China in an effort to try to extend the life of the company. And in the end, it didn't work out. Timex isn't quite what it used to be either. Things move on. This is the nature of competition. But you still have people like her who have this kind of very odd idea, especially given that she's the Secretary of Commerce, that things should be static, that American jobs are somehow sacrosanct, should never be touched. They should just be paid wages that couldn't be supported anywhere else. And, and Ejaz, this is, the heart of this is, yes, their industrial policy is everywhere. In fact, if you go to the IMF, they say, what is your industrial policy? If you don't have one, gee, we're not going to give you any money. What's your plan to get ahead? But you have these kind of nonsensical things being said by the U.S., and it adds up to mush. It doesn't make any sense. It's all tactics, strategies,
that's right. Because,
not a single end game in sight.
Yeah, my own sense is that, as I said, much of this is red herring. The real issue is different. I remember I had John Mearsheimer on our ThinkFest session about 4 years ago. Because of COVID, we had to do a virtual ThinkFest that year. And I was talking to him about the securities trap and the rest of it. And he said to me, he's somewhat of a celebrity in China because of what he says. So he said, the Chinese scholars said to me, is there a possibility that we can avoid this trap? And Mearsheimer said to me that I said to them, and then he said to the Chinese scholars, look, if you keep making money, but do not do anything to advance military technology or to strengthen yourself in a way that you can become a competitor to the United States in that arena, you might be able to avoid that trap. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. Before I close the program, I want to come to President Putin's visit to Beijing. Why is he here? I mean, is it again symbolic? Is there some substance to this? Is he looking for more support? Is this some kind of a debrief? Well, what were you asked, President Xi, and what did you say about me and my war in Ukraine? Give me a sense of that.
Okay, first off, the meeting with Putin was planned quite some time ago. So it's the European trip, which, although it was on the books, was not in solid form until afterwards. I think most people have unfortunately reversed it. What has happened, I think, is Xi at their last meeting, 2023, said, look, at the end of the day, the only place that this is going to be settled, we're talking about Ukraine, is at the negotiating table. This is a diplomatic issue. It's never going to be solved in the battlefield. Well, he didn't say that part, but I think that was inferred. Anyways, year on, Ukraine is losing. Russia is winning. But keep in mind, Russia can't afford to take on too much more territory within Ukraine that is not majority Russian. And the reason I say that is a lot of blood has been spilled. And if you take over areas that are full of Ukrainians, they will probably continue to fight you. They will, at least you'll have to have an armed garrison there, and that will be very, very costly over the long term. Putin obviously had his goals. He would like to close Ukraine off from the Black Sea and have that, in essence, belong to Russia. He would like to solidify the borders and things like that. But it seems like it's time to go to the table. And I think part of this was going to Europe and having Macron, of course, say, gee, this is our big issue. We don't even, it's very hard for us to even think about cooperating with China unless you make the war stop. Ironic, given that the war was not started by China. China is not supporting it militarily, not like the U.S. throwing bombs and bullets into Gaza. They have been very, very careful about that, but are still coming under intense scrutiny as if, for some reason, they're at fault. No one seems to be talking about India and the fact that India is buying the largest amount of Russian oil, or the other countries that are doing the same. It always boils down to China is at fault, and that has to do with the geopolitical issues. So she is trying to orchestrate this, and I think it's smart. There's no trust on the Russian side. What happened with the two peace attempts that were prior to this outbreak a couple of years ago. Merkel and also Hollande admitted they never had any intention of following through with the peace process. So how do you trust somebody when they obviously, are just saying we're not going to agree? So It's going to take a different set of people at the table, perhaps Turkey, other countries that have a interest in this, and there has to be, in the end, a final resolution of territory and also security. This whole thing started because Europe and America were pressing Russia by going into Ukraine, threatening to, in essence, have missiles 5 minutes from Moscow. In the U.S., we went ballistic and literally threatened nuclear Armageddon because the Russians were going to put missiles in Cuba. So this is not something new to us. But anyway, in the end, there has to be some sort of peace. I think they're moving towards that. Obviously, Putin has a bigger hand now than he did. But continuing the senseless deaths when
I think it's moving towards some kind of armistice at some point, either this year or early next year, and in the wake of Putin's, I think he's aiming for, as you rightly said, at least 2 other oblasts that are Russian speaking, but it's in the future. One final question before I close this program, kind of circling back to Europe. We talk about Europe as a collective noun. China would also like, I assume, for the European Union to remain a sort of functional, not just functional idea, but a functional institution. But it seems to me, given various developments within Europe also and across the Atlantic also, which we talked about Trump's arrival on the scene. Do you think China is also perhaps bracing for disruptions that might just dent this collective noun, Europe, while hoping that the collective noun remains functional as an institution?
No, I would disagree with that. It is in China's interest to have a stronger Europe, especially given the current circumstances. The one person who can unite Europe at this point is Donald Trump. If he goes forward with his 60% tariffs at a time when Europe is feeling so much pain economically, that is going to do away with a lot of goodwill. And Europe is already talking about they need to have their own currency. They need to, in essence, risk themselves from the United States, both economically, politically, and militarily. And if Trump does half of what he says, you're going to hear a race to form a stronger, better Europe. And for China, that's better because they can be independent. They can weigh things based on whether it's good or not for their people, instead of trying to follow the ideological angles of the U.S. as it tries to suppress China and Russia.
I agree. I mean, my question basically was that, as I said, that China obviously would want this collective noun to remain functional and institutional, but could possibly also be bracing for disruptions. But it's always great to talk to you, Aina. Especially it's
Here's
been a
mine.
while, and I'm so happy that I could get you to talk about these things. This is all
Anytime.
from this episode. If you're looking for useful policy discussions, subscribe to the CESPA channel. That way, you get a heads up on new episodes. Until next time, goodbye and stay safe.